The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, welcome everyone. And before we get started tonight, we have a little bit of housekeeping before we get into tonight's stories.
Yes, we do. And if you haven't already, it would really mean a lot to us if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favorite listening platform, whether it be on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to our podcast. It really helps us become more visible and recommended, and it would really help us out.
Yeah, because we're a small podcast and we don't have deep pockets to advertise like a lot of the big podcasts that are backed by big sponsors. So every person you tell about us or any review that you leave helps new people find us.
Yes, it really does. And you're helping the small podcasters out there by doing so. And don't just do it for us, do it for all of your favorite podcasts. So much time goes into researching and editing, and it helps out more than you can realize. So again, please take a moment when you have the time.
And if you already have, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Also, if you enjoyed our Halloween episode of Spooky Tales, they actually came from our book, 13 Creepy Urban Legends. So if you'd like to read all of the tales, because we only did maybe, I think, 6 of them, and there's 13 of them, you can purchase it on Amazon Kindle.
Or if you're into science fiction with a paranormal tie-in, you could check out Beth's novel, Project Earth.
It's technically young adult sci-fi because the main protagonist is 17 years old, but several of the secondary characters are in their 30s, so I think it would fit a larger audience than just young adult.
Yeah, I think so.
But anyway, you can find links to both of those books on our website, whereourmindswander.com.
Yeah, so if you haven't, go check it out. So that about wraps it up for our housekeeping. So Beth, why don't you get us started tonight?
All right. The mummified creature that has sat encased in a fireproof box at the Enjuin temple in Asaguchi, Japan, is at least 300 years old. Believed to have sacred powers of healing and immortality, people have flocked to the temple for years, hoping to at least see the creature that could help heal them. The 12-inch-long mummy, with its human-like hands posed near its grimacing human-like face and long, curved tail fin, is immediately recognizable. It has to be a mermaid. But not the kind of mermaid we've read about in books. Anyone might find the idea of a beautiful half-woman, half-fish creature a little hard to believe.
Yeah, it does sound a little fishy to me.
Oh my God.
I know, but I had to.
Well, you didn't really have to, but I'm sure we're all glad you did.
It would have been bugging me if I didn't.
This mermaid, with its shrunken features, appears incredibly real, especially when you look closely. Its hands are almost reptilian. Its entire body appears to be one piece. There are no telltale signs that it was stitched together somehow. Its tiny teeth look fish-like, even though its skull is obviously human-esque. If mermaids are real, then the Enjuin temple mummy undoubtedly fit the bill. The temple's mermaid's history can be traced back to the mid-1700s, when it was allegedly purchased by a feudal lord from an Osaka fisherman. He then gave it to the Kojima family. The mermaid came with a card that basically said it was caught in a fisherman's net near Tosa in the Enjuin area. So, the mermaid was pretty old, since Tosa was a feudal state and the Enjuin era ended in 1741. Somehow, the mermaid ended up at the Enjuin temple. Mermaids are historically pretty important in traditional Japanese beliefs. For example, they are considered to possess powers of immortality, and if you eat the flesh of a mermaid, you will gain that power. There is a legend in Japan about a woman who lived for 800 years because she accidentally ate mermaid flesh. For the last 40 years, the Enjuin Temple mermaid has been stored in a fireproof box to keep it from deteriorating, and recently the temple allowed it to finally be analyzed through 3D scans. What they found was probably pretty disappointing. The mummy was indeed a mashup of several animals, all stuck together with metal pins to a doll shape and then painted with charcoal powder. The thing is, it's still really old. They were able to date it to the 1800s, and it was incredibly well made.
Yeah, it was really well done. I mean, even if it is fake, the craftsmanship is excellent.
It looks darn real to me, I have to say.
It does. And I'm surprised when you were living in Japan, you didn't go see it.
I didn't know about it then. I've said before, when I was a kid, I didn't know nothing.
Yeah, now I see. You could have went in the Fiji Mermaid.
The Enjuin mermaid is one of the 13 known creatures housed in temples and museums across Japan, and they are more commonly known by what Wes just called them, their nickname, Fiji mermaids. Even though the Enjuin temple mermaid was proven to be fake, many people in Japan still firmly believe that the mummy is sacred. They logically point out that it's still an incredible piece of workmanship and should be treated that way. And if people get a sense of relief just by looking at it, then it really does hold some power. It was especially important during the pandemic because people needed and wanted that sense of healing and protection. A few Fiji mermaids even made it to the United States. But before I go any further, I should probably explain why they're called Fiji mermaids. It's because the backstory for one of the very first ones ever seen was that it was found off the coast of Fiji.
You know, I think I saw one when we were at the local fair back in, I think it was the 1970s. They had exhibits.
Mm-hmm.
Back then they used to have all kinds. And they had something very similar to it.
That's really cool.
I know. It was really neat.
Anyway, in 1906, a Navy sailor named L.C. Bishop returned to Ohio from service in Japan and donated a Fiji mermaid to the Clark County Historical Society. 117 years later, the mummified mermaid was analyzed by researchers at Northern Kentucky University. According to allthat'sinteresting.com, Joseph Kress, a radiologist at NKU, determined that the Clark mermaid is a mixture of, quote, at least 3 different species externally. It has the head and torso of a monkey, the hands of some sort of amphibian, and the tail from an undetermined species of fish. It was constructed with wooden rods, metal pins, and paper mache, as well as cotton stuffing, and it was also constructed in the 1800s. So it seems that, like the jackalope, Fiji mermaids were a popular creation during the 19th century. Even P.T. Barnum had one in his museum in New York City.
Well, of course he did.
Of course. Why wouldn't he? For centuries, people believed they were real because they were constructed so darn well. But that got me thinking, what if they had been real? Aren't there other creatures out there that are just as strange and unusual, but also 100% real? So, I decided to take a look at some weird creatures that have been discovered in the last 20 years. Take the Siphusoctum gregarium, for example.
Can you say that again?
Well, since I barely said it the first time, Siphusoctum gregarium. Siphusoctum gregarium.
I think you nailed it.
I have no clue.
Close enough.
This unpronounceable thing is a 500-million-year-old sea plant that was found fossilized in Canada recently. According to a LiveScience.com article from 2013, the plant looked exactly like modern-day tulips, except it was an actual animal. They were about the length of a dinner knife, and they pumped water through their tulip bulb-like heads, filtering out the water and munching on the sea creatures that got caught behind. They're so bizarre that scientists can't figure out where they fit into the evolutionary tree.
So they're kind of like an underwater Venus flytrap.
Exactly, but they pump the water up through the bottom and out the top, out the bulb part instead of the other way around.
Right.
Which is what you would expect, that they'd suck it in through the bulb part.
Right. That's interesting.
So those of you listening might say, yeah, but that was from 500 million years ago. And it's pretty cool, but what about more current species? Well, scientists are discovering 15,000 new species a year, so there's bound to be some pretty weird ones. Like the harp sponge that was discovered off the coast of California in the year 2000. It looks like the remnants of a delicate, fragile rib cage that has been underwater for a very long time, as if the bones of a long-dead fish are sticking up out of the ocean floor. It doesn't have any outer skin. It just looks like a rib cage. It doesn't look like it could be a living creature, but it most definitely is, and it catches and digests prey as they unknowingly swim through its rib-like appendages. But if that doesn't seem all that strange, there's also the lovely zombie worm.
Ooh, zombie worms.
They're real.
Really?
Yes.
I've never heard of them.
They're pretty much exactly what they sound like, too. They feed off of dead carcasses, except they don't even have mouths. They're creepy.
Yeah.
Zombie worms, they feed off of dead things, but they have no mouths.
How big are these things?
Worm size.
Oh.
Like earthworm size. In 2012, the Society for Experimental Biology announced that their researchers had figured out how zombie worms feed off the dead. They excrete an acid that eats away at the bones to the point that they can absorb it. But even more weird, male zombie worms live permanently attached to the females. Their only function is to fertilize them.
They're a little needy, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, I don't even like regular earthworms, so seeing a zombie worm with all these other worms attached to it, secreting acid and deteriorating bone to feed off of it, would put me over the edge. The majority of us, thankfully, don't live miles below the ocean, so we don't really have to worry about harp sponges and zombie worms. But what about elephant shrews and ghost slugs? In Tanzania in 2008, a sengi or elephant shrew was discovered, according to newscientist.com. Elephant shrews, which basically look like reddish-brown rodents with a gray squirrel's head and an unusually long, pointed nose, aren't shrews at all. They're more closely related to elephants, aardvarks, and sea cows.
They're kind of cute, though.
They are. But what makes this new elephant shrew, with its almost absurdly long, pointy proboscis, is its extreme size. They are the size of large rabbits. What also makes them unique is that they're considered living fossils. Now, that doesn't mean that they appear fossilized. They're quite furry and they are quite cute, despite their enormous size. They're called living fossils because the ones currently inhabiting Tanzania are identical to fossilized remains from 23 million years ago. So they haven't changed one bit evolutionary-wise in 23 million years.
That's rather odd.
It's very strange.
Because you would figure they would have changed to adapt more to newer conditions.
I know. That's what I'm saying. There's some weird animals out there. And lastly, there's the ghost slug of whales, which gives zombie worms a run for their money. Ghost slugs were first discovered in 2006. Ghost slugs are so white that they almost glow, and they also eat flesh. But don't worry, they don't eat human flesh. They do inhabit people's gardens, though. Ghost slugs will burrow down into earthworm holes, stretching their bodies out incredibly long and flat. Then they use antennae on their heads to sniff out worms or other unsuspecting slugs. Then they use their sharp, spiny mouth parts to stab their victims before they literally suck the entire earthworm or slug into their own body while the worm or other slug is still very much alive.
Oh, they're creepy little bastards.
They are. It's just like slurp, and the whole thing is inside their body.
Damn.
Now, to be fair, with the exception of the elephant shrew, none of the other animals I've talked about look like mashups, like a Fiji mermaid. So let's take a second and let's look at everyone's favorite mashup, the platypus. Because in the last 20 years, new research has revealed something new about them too. The duck-billed platypus is a monotreme, which means it's in a class almost by itself. There are only 5 known monotreme species in the world. Essentially, a monotreme is a mammal that lays eggs. Platypuses have venomous spurs and glowing fur. But I don't know if everyone also knows that platypuses also sweat milk, and they have 10 sex chromosomes. They sweat milk. I didn't know that.
No, it's not anything I've ever read about a platypus.
I know.
But then again, I haven't read much into platypuses either.
I know. I had to look up if it's platypi or platypuses. It can be either. So the 10 sex chromosomes stuff is the new stuff that's been discovered. So gene mapping of a male platypus done back in 2018 revealed that male platypuses have 5 Y chromosomes and 5 X chromosomes, which, for whatever reason, makes them genetically more like chickens than like humans, which explains the female ones lay eggs, even though they're mammals.
Right. I wonder what their eggs taste like.
Not like chicken.
Probably not, but there must be some tribe out there that eats platypus eggs. You would think, right?
Yeah, probably. So, there are some pretty weird creatures out there, and I am kind of bummed that Fiji mermaids have been completely debunked, though. But who knows? Maybe somewhere out in the wild, a jackalope and a Fiji mermaid are hanging out together, just laughing it up.
Yeah, I can imagine. And imagine this. They hook up. Voila. New species.
What would their name be? A jackalope maid. A jackalope maid. I don't know.
Works for me. It's whatever you want it to be.
Can you imagine being out in your garden in Wales and you're just planting flowers and you pull up a zombie worm, or not a zombie worm, a ghost slug, this big, long, glowing white thing that's all stretched out and it's got like...
It looked like snot.
I know. And it's munching on another worm that's still squiggling around inside of it.
Yeah. Nope, not for me. Well, dear, that was pretty interesting. I've learned a lot.
I learned some things I didn't know, and I'm surprised I haven't had any nightmares with, zombie worms and harp sponges making an appearance. But
well, maybe tonight.
Oh, yay! I can hardly wait. Thank you.
Let me see if I can put a little something on your pillow so when you roll over, a little zombie worm's inching its way towards you.
Even if it was a regular worm, I'd freak out. They just smell. I don't like the way they smell. You know how in the spring and they come up and they're like all over the sidewalks and they have this smell that turns my stomach.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me.
Do you smell it though, or is it just me?
No, I've smelled them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't like it. Why are you looking at me like that?
I just learned something new every day about you, dear. You don't like the smell of worms.
I'll hold a worm. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, you will. Well, I've taken you fishing.
Yeah, I don't...
You hold the worm pretty well then.
Yeah, I don't mind touching them. I just don't like the way they smell. Anyway, moving on. Hey, did you know? Sometimes old maps really do lead to buried treasure, even if they're not actually buried treasure maps at all. In 2014, two professors decided to take another look at a 4,000-year-old map carved on a stone that was hidden away in a museum storeroom. To their surprise, the map, which to the untrained eye looks like nothing but a bunch of swirls and squiggles, is an 80% exact match for a 13 by 18 mile area in France. Because of their discovery, archaeologists now believe the Saint Belec slab is a map of a Bronze Age city. Exploration and excavation of the area should take about 15 years to complete, but when they do, who knows what treasures might be found. Who'da thunk it? So where did your mind wander this week?
Well, I just happened to stumble upon the subject of my story while I was researching something else, which seems to happen a lot lately, and I found it pretty interesting. Hundreds of people came from all around to the Mount Pleasant area of New York to attend the funeral of Jules Bourglet in 1889. Bourglet was a beloved figure in their communities, and when a carpenter named Henry Miller discovered Bourglet's body in Sawmill Woods Cave, people across 2 states mourned his passing. Yet, his tombstone in the Sparta Cemetery in Austin, New York, was engraved with this intriguing epitaph. Final resting of Jules Bourglet of Lyons, France, the Leatherman, who regularly walked a 365-mile route through Westchester and Connecticut from the Connecticut River to the Hudson, living in caves in the years 1858 to 1889. Now, there is a lot to be intrigued by when it comes to the wanderer known as the Leatherman, and it turned out not everything on his tombstone was true, but the parts you'd expect to be false, like he walked a continuous 365-mile loop for 30 years, or that he lived in caves, those were actually true. When I started putting his story together, I was thinking that it's likely a lot of you would be listening to this as you commute to work, which is kind of fitting since you'd be traveling your own daily set of miles. Or for those of you who are taking a break during your day to listen to us, that fits too, since the Leatherman's story is about rest as well. Either way, I'm looking forward to telling you the true tale of the Leatherman. He was 5'7", and by at least one account, If he had been clean-shaven, he could have been quite handsome. But that wasn't enough to make dozens of townsfolk in towns throughout Connecticut take notice. The man was dressed in the most unusual way. He was dressed from head to toe in leather. His shirt, vest, trousers, coat and hat, and scarf, all of it was entirely brown leather. Some speculated, and were right, that the only non-leather thing on his body were the wooden soles of his shoes.
That seems unusual to me that even his shirt would be made out of leather. Like, you don't hear about that very often.
Right. The first time he entered Harwington, Connecticut, in 1858, the man was not much more than 20 years old. But just a few months later, his continual appearance was so common that schoolchildren in the towns like Branford, Connecticut, were so used to the sight of him that they were encouraged by their teacher to go outside and look for him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always in short, incomprehensible French or short English phrases like, thank you so much. When people asked him questions, he was more likely to grunt and walk away rather than say anything at all. Soon people in Connecticut towns and cities of Portland, Burlington, Knesco, South Salem, Croton Falls, Yorktown, Shrub Oak, Briarcliff, Bedford Hills, Greenwich, Danbury, New Fairfield, Watertown, Middletown, and New Canaan, as well as townsfolk in Westchester County, New York, realized something extraordinary. The man dressed all in leather was reappearing in their towns every 34 to 36 days, within 30 minutes of the time he last appeared.
That's wild.
I know. You could set your watch by him.
Huh.
Word got around, and they soon realized something even more extraordinary. The man was walking the same exact 365 clockwise mile loop over and over. His route never changed, and he never shared his reason as to why he did it. It didn't matter how bad the weather got. He was so punctual that people swore that they could set their watches by it, which is ironic since the Leatherman didn't own a watch himself.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. So he was walking a 365-mile loop over and over and over without stopping. And he was going through all of those towns and showing up again in the town every 34 to 36 days, within 30 minutes of the last time he'd been there.
Right. Incredible, isn't it?
Wow.
I know. People figured out that he didn't own much at all, since all he carried was a satchel, made of leather, of course, which contained basic camping supplies and a French Catholic Bible. And despite people asking, he never revealed a single thing about himself, not where he was from, why he was walking, or even his name. He never stole or vandalized anything. He never bothered anyone. And when the townsfolk began preparing meals for him, he always appeared to be very grateful. In fact, it became the popular thing to do. An honor even to present the Leatherman with some food. People in each town would offer him a bowl of stew or a mug of hot coffee, maybe even a loaf of bread. The Leatherman would accept the food with a nod of his head and go off by himself to eat. Then knock on the person's door to return their dishes after. He'd nod one more time, and then he'd continue on his way. He reportedly liked to chew tobacco and smoke, and he would pick up partially smoked cigars that he found along his way, but he never once picked up any brand new tobacco that people purposely left out for him.
That's interesting. It's like he didn't want to take charity. I mean, like the meals were okay, but maybe because the tobacco was a luxury. I mean, I'm speculating, but because the tobacco was a luxury, he didn't want to take it, I guess.
I have no clue.
Huh.
And I've thought it over, but perhaps he didn't want to take something more expensive like that.
Right.
It wasn't something that he truly needed. It's something he liked to do.
Right.
But like I said, that's just pure speculation.
Yeah.
And like I said before, his route never changed. although he was known to avoid certain houses if he felt the owner was too nosy. And sometimes he'd continue through a town without stopping if he felt too uneasy. This only happened a few times. For example, once a bunch of unkind boys tried to force liquor on him, and he avoided their town after that. He did frequently stop at the Middlesex County jailhouse for a meal, but never a bed. In fact, he never slept in any of the towns. Instead, he had staked out several caves, hundreds of them actually, within the 365 miles. He slept in one of his many caves every single night, even in the winter, although it did cause him to suffer frostbite every once in a while. During the years when the Leatherman was making his trek, he was one of many vagrant men crossing the country, displaced by the Civil War. It was such a widespread issue that Connecticut enacted an anti-vagrancy tramp law in 1879. But townsfolk truly felt that the Leatherman was different, and 10 separate villages passed ordinances that specifically exempted him.
That's cool.
That's very cool.
They were watching out for him. That's awesome.
People really cared a lot about him, and in 1888, the Connecticut Humane Society had arrested him, just so he could be taken to the hospital for more permanent shelter, food, and care. But, of course, he left after just a few hours, although the history does get a little fuzzy on why. Some accounts say the hospital found him, quote, sane except for an emotional affliction, and released him. Some accounts say he escaped.
I think I like the idea of him escaping better if I had a vote. You know, he'd be like, this is not for me. I'm out of here.
Right. But they were looking out for his well-being.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted to medically check him over.
Yeah.
And the thing is, even though no one ever reported the Leatherman offering to perform odd jobs, they adamantly insisted that he was an honest man who never stole a thing, and he always had money. He'd stop by the general stores and replenish the same supplies on a regular basis: coffee, crackers, pie, sardines, bread, beer, and brandy. He always paid with cash on the spot.
So where was he getting his money from?
Well, I'm thinking he probably did time in the war.
Oh. Well, that makes sense.
Right.
So he was getting like a pension.
Right.
Wow, okay. That makes sense.
That's what I'm thinking. So yes, he was an absolute enigma, and people were fascinated by him. And since he never offered a single detail about his life, townsfolk began inventing their own origin stories about him. Since he spoke fluent French and never accepted meat on Fridays, the rumor began that he was likely French-Canadian, if not from France. The Leatherman was so well known that he became a kind of celebrity. Papers all over Connecticut and New York ran articles about him. The New York Times referred to him as, quote, mysterious, eccentric pedestrian. But then reporters, eager to sell their papers, expanded the Leatherman's origin story on their own. One article published in the Waterbury Daily American in 1884 claimed they knew the Leatherman's real name because the reporter had gotten a lengthy conversation with a leather-clad man.
Well, that doesn't make sense since he hardly ever spoke to anybody, and those were people he saw once a month.
Right.
Why would he talk to a reporter at length?
Right, because the reporters, they'd make stuff up.
Right.
The article claimed his real name was Jules Bourglet, and he was once engaged to the daughter of a wealthy French leather maker. Bourglet had disgraced the woman's family by somehow losing all their money, and he was forced to flee France. His endless walking loop was his penance. It's quite original, though.
It is. Of course, it was a leather maker, right? Because he was wearing all leather. It had to be leather related.
Right. Another reporter claimed that his name was Rudolph Mosey, a French shoemaker. He had sent his wife to America ahead of him, and when he arrived in Connecticut, he was devastated to discover that she had died. Again, his endless walking route was his penance.
Of course.
Others built on the Jules Bourglet story, only they added that he had accidentally burnt down her father's leather factory, trapping her inside. The devastated family ran him out of France.
Huh. So they got like more and more gruesome as they kind of wove their tales about him, right? Yeah. He only disgraced the family, but then no, he actually, accidentally killed her, and yeah.
And as though his story wasn't just fine the way it was, I mean, it was pretty spectacular to me.
Yeah.
What he had done, they had to come up with all this other bullshit to explain it.
Why he was doing what he was doing.
Right. So who knows if the Leatherman ever read any of these articles, or if anyone ever tried to read them to him. He just continued walking and passing through towns. And people pointed out repairing his leather suit along the way. He was frequently seen adding patches to it, altering its look with every new layer. People recalled years later that it rustled when he walked. Then on March 24th, 1889, Henry Miller, the carpenter I mentioned before, not the playwright, brought his wife up to Sawmill Woods Cave in Mount Pleasant, New York, because she wanted to see the famous journeyman for herself. They found him inside the cave. He had passed away at the estimated age of 54. His body was brought to the coroner at nearby Sing Sing prison, who determined the cause of death was mouth cancer.
That's sad.
I know it is. It really is. And he was only 54.
And he'd been walking for 30 years.
Right.
30 years.
He must have been in spectacular shape.
Other than...
Well, the mouth cancer.
Yeah. But that's from the chewing tobacco, probably, in the...
More than likely.
Yeah.
Then he was brought to the White and Dorsey Funeral Home, where hundreds of people came to view his body. His death made the front page of New York City papers. However, the Jules Bourglet name had stuck, and the Leatherman, who was not actually named Jules Bourglet, was buried in Sparta Cemetery in Ossining, New York, with a tombstone bearing a false name. His leather suit was put on display. It traveled as well, from a New York City museum to a carnival show on Coney Island. It weighed a remarkable 65 pounds. Unfortunately, though, it was lost in a fire. But the Leatherman's story didn't end there. He had become such a legend that hundreds of people continued to visit his grave. When Route 9 was under construction in 2011, his gravesite became dangerously close to the constant traffic. Fearing that visitors to his gravesite might be hit by oncoming cars, authorities decided to move his resting place to a spot further inside the cemetery. They also thought that if they exhumed him, they would have the opportunity to figure out who he really was. Maybe through DNA testing, they could finally give him a name. Maybe they could discover more of his actual story. But when they opened his gravesite, they made a disheartening discovery. Erosion in time had taken its toll. All they found was a few pieces of disintegrated wood and coffin nails. There was no body left to test.
Seriously?
Yeah.
It was just gone.
Just gone.
Wow. I'm sure that added to the rumors of his story. I'm sure people said they saw his ghost and all kinds of stuff.
So they brought in a new coffin and put what was left of the Leatherman's burial soil and the original nails inside it. The new coffin was interred in a new plot. Leatherman historian and author Dan W. DeLuca raised money to purchase a new gravestone, which simply reads, The Leatherman. The wandering man with no name, dressed head to toe in leather, has all the markings of an urban legend. But the truth is, he really existed. There are more than a handful of photographs of the man himself to prove it.
Are there really? There's photographs of him?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, cool.
In one of my favorites, he's sitting in front of a house. Someone has just placed a small but fancy wooden table in front of him, covered in a delicate white tablecloth. The meal in front of him, either bread or meat and a large apple and a sprig of grapes, is on a white plate. The leather man is looking directly at the photographer with a steady gaze from underneath the brim of his leather hat. His expression is somewhat annoyed, as if the photographer stuff is, a huge nuisance. He clutches a walking stick in his right hand, and his leather satchel lays at his feet. He still doesn't have a name. His story is still a mystery, which is exactly the way he wanted it. And although I would love to know his true identity, I also like the fact that it still remains a mystery.
I think in this case, it is kind of cool that it's still a mystery because, I don't know, I like the story the way it is.
Yeah.
He was just a guy doing his thing, and he wasn't bothering anybody, and people were looking out for him.
Yeah, I think it's just amazing. For 30 years, he walked the 365-mile route through the woods to the caves.
Continuously without stopping.
Right.
That's amazing.
It's like he just didn't want to be bothered by people, but at some point you need to go around people in order to get things, to stay alive.
Right. Which he always had money for, apparently,
Right.
which is intriguing, too.
Right.
It's a very cool story. I wonder if you were to go out, if you could still find some of the caves that he...
Yes, you can.
That's cool.
They're out there.
That's cool. We've probably been by some and didn't even realize it.
We probably have.
Yeah. See, it wasn't when I was just a kid. There are still things that I don't even know I've seen when I've seen them.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode.
I think so. As always, if you want to know more about the topics that we covered, you can always check our sources in our show notes. That's where we based our research on, and there's always more to discover if you want to look for yourself.
Yeah, it gives you a jumping point.
Yeah.
A jumping off point, I must say.
Right. Well, they might jump up and down if they're excited about sources.
Right. Well, you would.
I would.
I know you do a little happy dance when you find things you're interested in.
This is true. All right. Well, I guess like Wes said, that about wraps it up for this episode.
Join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.